Okay, so we've been talking about faith over the last while. We've been going through the book of Hebrews and specifically Hebrews 11 over the last several weeks. And my hope is that it's been spurring you on in your faith. That's the whole idea. If it isn't affecting us in some way, we may as well just go home. So my hope is that somehow you've been looking at the whole thing of faith and really seeing how it applies to you. I said to you, we've intentionally been going slowly through this chapter because it reflects on a lot of the Old Testament stories. Many of you are familiar with the Old Testament stories, but some of you are newer to faith in Jesus, and so it's helpful sometimes to just actually tell some of the stories, even though we can't get into all the details of them, but we are doing some of that. So faith affects how we live. Obviously, there's faith in Jesus, just our faith in Jesus, but if we really have faith in Him, it affects us in all circumstances of life. It affects us in the huge decisions. It affects us in what we might just think are the small decisions if we really are living in true trust in Jesus. In the case of the recipients of this letter, although it's not really even a letter, some have almost said it's almost like a written sermon, the whole book of Hebrews. It was written to people where some of them were tempted to leave the faith. And so he's really calling them to just have faith in Jesus. And so that's really what the emphasis of this all is. And so it applies that way to any of us where that may be applicable. But obviously, just the whole thing of having faith. So today, my topic is faith. Totally banking on what God says. Okay, so let's look at Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to read 23 to 29. And I'm going to turn around and read it because I have a little bit of a different translation in front of me than what I have up there. And normally it's on my computer. So here we go. By faith, so Hebrews 11, 23 to 29. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Next slide. Keep going till I get some words. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. So Moses, it's all about Moses, first of all about his parents, but specifically talking about the faith that he had. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about today is faith is doing what is right regardless of repercussions. And so obviously we're now talking just about the faith of Moses' parents. I'm basically going to go through almost verse by verse this whole thing. So first of all, verse 23 again says, by faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because he was no ordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Somehow when Moses was born, they saw this child, and obviously he was good looking because all children are good looking to their parents. Isn't he cute? Yeah, I guess so. But it specifically says that there was something special about him. The book of Exodus says he was because he was a fine child. But the implication with all these texts, the book of Acts talks about as well, the implication of all these texts is they knew there's something special about this child. We've got to do everything we can to preserve his life. And so if you can imagine in terms of what was actually going on at that time, literally every male child of the Israelites was being thrown into the Nile River as soon as they were born, okay? If the Egyptians saw, oh, there's a woman walking around, she's getting ready to give birth at some point, they kept close tabs on them, and they made sure that those children all got thrown into the Nile. I mean, just brutal, okay? So whatever they did to hide all this from them, even as Moses was specifically given birth, and specifically the writer of the Hebrews says, they didn't fear the king's edict. Very likely, if they would have been found to have kept a child when this child was supposed to be killed, I mean, this is brutal stuff, very likely they would have been executed themselves. And so he specifically makes a point of, they didn't fear the king's edict. Okay, no, there's something about this son. Obviously, that's true of any parent with their son or daughter. But they were like, nope, we're not giving into this. And so, for those of you that are not familiar with the story, so when Moses was about 3 months old, they realized we just can't keep him quiet anymore, and they're going to discover he's here. So they made a papyrus basket, coated it with tar and pitch and stuff so it would be waterproof, put him in the Nile River, and basically, okay, God, you got to look after him now. And so his sister goes out and looks to see what happens with this basket with the baby Moses in there. And lo and behold, the daughter of Pharaoh is coming down to the Nile River to bathe with her attendants and everything else. And hey, what's that basket doing over there? And so the daughter of Pharaoh sends her servant girl, go get that basket for me. And so she goes and gets this basket, and it's a baby. I don't know how she knew it was a Hebrew child, if you could tell by different facial features or a blanket, doesn't really matter, but somehow she knew it was a Hebrew child. And by this time, Moses' sister was up there and, hey, we need to get someone to nurture this baby and feed this child. And, oh, you want me to get one of the Hebrew women? Yeah, good idea. And lo and behold, mom gets to nurse baby Moses. And we don't know to what age, but at some point, then she goes back to be in the care of Pharaoh's daughter. So the whole point that I'm just trying to make here, and that the writer to the Hebrews makes, is this commitment to doing what is right, what God says, regardless of the repercussions. And they were totally committed. This is what God's led us to do, and we are going to do it. And so that is very true for all of us in all kinds of situations. It can be anything from being honest, when a bit of a lie might just kind of make things a lot easier for you. No, I'm gonna go with what's right. If I tell the truth, I know it's gonna mess things up, but I'm gonna tell the truth. As a teen, sometimes doing what is right, doing what God would say, puts you outside the group. And I know different ones of you have experienced that in your growing up years, where, no, I'm just gonna go with what God says. You're a Christian at that point, and you were firmly committed to that. But it made a difference in terms of friends. It made a difference in terms of those things. And so it's a huge example of how faith impacts us in our daily lives. Secondly, faith is looking out for others instead of our own comfort. Let me just reread verses 24 to 26 there. It says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Now, the references here to, obviously, Moses grew up as a son of Pharaoh's daughter, grandson of Pharaoh. And it's referring now to, here he is 40 years old, the Bible tells us. It was, okay, he's already a man. And at some point, he goes back to see how his people are doing. He still has this total connection with the Israelites, and he goes back and he sees this Hebrew person being totally mistreated and beaten by an Egyptian, and we know the story, beats him up, actually kills the guy, pretty brutal story. But he makes a point here of Moses' faith. You know what? What was far more important to him was God's people than just being someone who can live in luxury and privilege, and I'm just going to stay here. And so the faith he's talking about here had to do with that, but also later on, by faith, Moses went with God's commands when God told him to go and lead his people out of Egypt. Now, we're sometimes pretty hard on Moses because we focus on his times when he blew it, or times when he missed the mark in some way. But we forget the cost that this was to Moses to believe God and to be obedient to him. It meant being completely unpopular, to say the least, with the king or the Pharaoh of Egypt. I'm now talking 40 years later, so a different one by that time. It also meant getting the backlash from the Israelites. He was the most unpopular guy there. I mean, when he went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go, this is what God says. Oh, I'm going to make it harder on the Israelites. I'm not going to give them any straw to make all these bricks they have to make for us. And so the leaders of the Israelites come to Moses, what are you doing? And they give him the what for. I mean, talk about faith that it required on Moses' part. I'm doing what God's told me to do. I'm going to keep on doing it, regardless of what the Israelites say, the very people I'm trying to set free, and the Egyptians. And so we see how God speaks to Moses to set his people free. I'm now jumping back right to when he was tending sheep for 40 years, minding his own business. God appears in the burning bush and says, here's what I want you to do. And Moses is like, I don't want to go. In a nutshell, that's what he's saying. Well, what about this? What about this? You know, what are they going to say? How can I prove that it's really you that sent me and all this stuff? And Moses, I mean, he tries to think of every possible excuse for why he can't do it, and finally goes, well, you know what? I'm just not good at talking, to tell you the truth, God. Like, you know, can you send somebody else? Well, you know what? That was just an excuse because it's on the PowerPoint there, Acts 7 verse 22 says Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action. I mean, he just didn't want to go for every good reason. And finally, he submits to God's will and he concedes with, okay, can Aaron come with me? Okay, I'll do it if he could come and he could talk. In fact, I think it was Moses that did all the talking anyways. If you read the story, because constantly say Moses said this and Moses said this and Moses said this. So Aaron was just kind of there as support in some way through this whole thing. But he went in faith knowing what God had said. And I don't know if we have any idea the faith it took on Moses' part to just keep going back. For all of us, faith in God enables us to actually ultimately be willing. And by the way, I think we will all have times where we're somewhat resistant to what God might say. In fact, if you look at the various people that were called to some of those big assignments in the Bible, most of them resisted to start with. Most of them said, me? Are you kidding? I'm not going there. But once they came to that place of, okay, this really is God. God says he's going to give me what I need. I'm willing to lay myself down. I'm willing to do whatever he says. Romans 12, 1 and 2 tells us that in view of God's mercy, we're to offer our bodies as living sacrifices. And one of the biggies, I think, for all of us is to recognize, you know what? If we've come to Jesus, our life is not our own anymore. It's not just about doing what I want. It's about what does God want here. Life is not just all about me, but about what God wants. We're taking this VI course right now, Vineyard Institute course, and on Pauline literature. And Don Williams teaches the course. And he goes off on these little rants at different points. And all of us in the class just love the rants. In fact, they edited out some of his rants. He just started going, and then they edit. I was like, what? Come on. Like, we want to hear these things. But they did it for the sake of time, because he's going a little bit long. In a whole different context, he's talking about Pauline literature, and he talks about how we're saved totally by grace. It's not our effort, okay? It's not about, am I doing good enough and all this stuff. A bit of what Mark was talking about early on. But at one point in one of his rants, he says, it is up on the screen here as well, he says, quit being so narcissistic. Quit being so self-focused. Quit thinking it's all about you and about how well you're going to do all this stuff. And then he says, focus on Jesus and other people, and you'll be a happy person. That really hit me when he said this stuff. Focus on God and other people, and you'll be a happy person. And the people around you will start telling you how much they love you, because suddenly it's not all about you. It's suddenly about them. Suddenly it's about others. And he makes this statement in there. He says, goodbye migraine headaches, goodbye ulcers, goodbye arthritis, goodbye bad stomach. And I know there's medical reasons for some of these things, etc. But I went, whoa, this is a powerful statement. Focus on God and other people. That's what Moses did. He was totally about what's God saying, and he was totally about, I'm here for the sake of the Israelites. And so Moses quit thinking about himself and what was in it for him, and believed God and served people without thought for his own welfare. And so, in spite of his shortcomings, Moses was one of the ones in the Bible who is most commended for his faith. And I'm going to continue to give some examples of, wow, talk about how he did that. But this has huge application for all of our own lives. Verse 26, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead for his own reward. By the way, very interesting. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ. Some of you might go, somebody mixing stuff up here? Didn't Jesus only start in the New Testament? And we don't have time to talk about all this stuff, but there's what theologians have called Christophanies. In other words, there's numerous times in the Old Testament where actually in the New Testament it's described as Christ appearing in the Old Testament. Okay? Christ has always been. Jesus says before, Adam was I am. Christ has always been. Okay? And so there's one of those verses, and there's other verses that refer to Christ being there. Okay? In the wilderness. Okay, so that's a whole other thing. I don't have time to get into that, but I just thought I'd mention that because it's in our verse here. Okay, number 3. Faith is persevering because of who God is. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. So, he has these numerous encounters with Pharaoh. The second last time that Moses saw Pharaoh, Exodus 10, verse 28, says, Pharaoh said to Moses, get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me ever again. The day you see my face, you will die. These guys didn't make empty threats. Okay, when these pharaohs spoke, when they said, if you ever show up again, you're dead. Well, he did show up again. Talk about not fearing the king's anger. He's like, I'm just going to do what God tells me to do. Now, let me just make a point here. This whole thing that God had called Moses to do was no small undertaking. And I just want to say a couple of things regarding this, because sometimes we think, oh, he just did this stuff. The Bible tells us there were 600,000 men that left Egypt, plus women and children. Do you guys realize how many people that is? Now, that with Canadian-sized families, that's going to be at least a couple of million. Okay? So with families as many children as they had, I mean, conservatively speaking, it would be 2 to 3 million people that left Egypt. That's a lot of people. Now, I just looked up Greater Vancouver, 2.5 million people. Okay? That's how many people, at least, left Egypt. That's from, most of you know Vancouver geography a little bit, okay? So that's Vancouver, North Vancouver, West Vancouver, Richmond, Tawasin, Ladner, Burnaby, New West, Surrey, Langley, all the way up to about Aldergrove. That's how many people, at least that many people left. When he's talking about what God's calling him to do with all these people, that's what we're talking about. Moses trusts God in this whole thing. And he boldly leads the people out of Egypt. And the perseverance that the writer to the Hebrews talks about here comes into play on the long trek for 40 years with all these people. I just think of, could you imagine, at least 3 million people. Plus all their flocks and herds and sheep and cattle and everything else, and you're taking all these people somewhere. It's like, good grief, for 40 years. Was there ever a reason for Moses to get frustrated? Yes. But he kept believing what God says, kept believing. And Moses knew that he could trust God. And I just want to say, you know what? One of the things God will build in us, if we have faith in God, he will build perseverance in us. I'd like to suggest this morning, sometimes we think of the fruit of the Spirit, and we think that's all encompassing. It's not. That's just an example of the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit's way more than just those 9 things that are mentioned. A fruit of the Spirit is perseverance. If you're a person who's following God, you will persevere. All kinds of places where we need to persevere. How many of you are married here this morning? Put up your hands. Okay. Does it ever take perseverance? You're all just looking, of course I'm not going to say anything. My wife's sitting right beside me. You meet each other when my wife and I met each other when we were 14, okay? You meet each other, it's like, woo, everything's wonderful, right? I mean, just me and her, and I just want to spend the rest of my life with you. Why? Because whenever you're together, you're just doing fun stuff, right? And then eventually you get married. I still remember when Louise and I got married, and this older lady, well, we thought we were old. She probably wasn't very old, but we thought she was old. This lady who had 10 kids, she and her husband, in our church. And she came to me one day. We weren't married yet. She says, Hart, you think you're just going to go into the water up to your ankles, but it's actually going to be over your head. Going, what's she talking about? Then I found out. So, perseverance. You know what? You're saying to this person that you get married to, I will be faithful to you come hell or high water for the rest of my life. That takes perseverance. You're crazy to make that kind of commitment. You don't know what's going to come. Right? You have no clue. But at the same time, God calls us to make those kinds of commitments. God calls us to be faithful to one person for the rest of our lives. And it takes God saying, I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to stick with this person. I'm not just going to grin and bear it. I'm actually going to love them for the rest of my life. And I'm going to keep aiming to be the kind of person that really lays down my life for the other. I'm going to be the kind of person that has humility, the kind of person that wants to learn, the kind of person that wants to have humility, all that stuff. Talk about perseverance. It's one classic case of perseverance. But perseverance has effect in all different areas in our life. If you're just plain serving God in an area consistently, it takes perseverance. If you're a life group leader here, it takes perseverance. It takes, on an ongoing basis, God, what do you want to do this time? I'm going to keep praying for the group. I'm going to keep doing this stuff. It all takes stick-to-itiveness. And it's a key thing that Moses demonstrated. Just in our walk with God, to some of the stuff Mark was talking about this morning, to not just kind of go through the motions in our Christian life, but to actually be alive, to be listening to God, to really continue to foster our relationship with God, takes perseverance. And I think it's one of the big things that God wants to build in all of our lives, because it isn't always just fun and excitement with all kinds of things in life, but where we go, hey, but I want to continue to live this out in a way that's meaningful, in a way that God would want it to be. Fourthly, faith is banking on God's provision for salvation. Verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. And again, most of you know the story. Pharaoh, as Moses kept going to him, Pharaoh kept refusing. And so God kept telling Moses, tell him, I'm going to send this plague. Like, if he won't listen, I'm going to do this to finally break his will down. And Pharaoh kept resisting, plague of locusts, plague of frogs, all these different plagues, and he won't listen. Finally, God says, okay, one last time. I'm going to kill your firstborn in every family, and including the firstborn of your livestock, if you're not going to listen. And Pharaoh says, no way. And then God says to Moses, but I want to make provision for all the people of Israel. And I want, and this is the first time the Passover ever occurred. I want every family to get a lamb. I want you to kill the lamb at twilight, and then I want you to take the lamb and I want you to roast it over the fire. And I want you to take the blood of that lamb on every home, and I want you to paint it on your front door frame. And so as the destroying angel goes through Egypt, if I see the blood, there will be no destruction coming to your home. Now again, let me remind you how many people we're talking about. How would you get the news out without radio or TV or email or Twitter or what have you? Somehow he had to get the word out. By the way, everybody, this is really important. You have to do it on this day, not on any day. You have to do it. You have to put blood on the doorpost. I mean, he had to believe it himself to tell everybody else so that they would believe we actually need to do this. And you need to roast the lamb over the fire, and then you need to eat the whole thing. If it's going to be too big, make sure you bring bring two families together and eat the whole thing, and I will pass over you, and no destruction will come to you. And obviously we know what a graphic picture of what Jesus did, okay? Where he is, and he's called that in the New Testament. One of the things he's called our Passover lamb. And he actually was the one who was killed on our behalf. And so when we talk about the blood of Christ, like we just celebrated again this morning and do every Sunday, the blood of Christ is over us so that there's no destruction. Okay, anything that we had coming because of our sin, we don't have coming. And I just think again, okay, hold on. We're talking at least a couple of million people, and they all had to buy into this thing. And so when it says, by faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, it took faith on his part to go, we're doing this. This is God. This is what God's saying. And it takes faith on our part because, you know what? it sounds really strange to people if they've never heard of what? Jesus dying for you? Like, and that covers your sin? Like, what? What are you talking about? Like, you believe this stuff? It takes faith. It takes us believing and going, okay, I embrace that. But it affects how we live if we believe that. It totally affects how we live. And so I just have on the PowerPoint there, Moses had to believe it, and so did the people. And for us, it really is believing what Jesus did on the cross for us. To believe that means to be all in. If you believe it, it totally affects how you live. And then lastly, number 5, faith is stepping into the unknown. Verse 29. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. And again, put yourself in a story. You know, I think all these stories become far more meaningful if we actually take some time to think about what was actually going on. These people, all these Israelites who were now out of Egypt, all of them, all they knew was being slaves of the Egyptians. That's all they knew. That's the only life they knew. Being abused, being beaten, and so here they are. God has finally come through, and they're out of Egypt, and here they are camping beside the sea with all their flocks and herds and millions of people, and in the distance all of a sudden they see Pharaoh's army coming. And you can predict what they would do. They start crying out to Moses, "What did you do? Like, no graves in Egypt? Like, you have to bring us out here to get killed?" And so God speaks and says, "Here's what I'm going to do." And so God goes wall of fire between the Israelites and the Egyptians, and then here's the interesting thing. So the Israelites are against him, the Egyptians are against him, and God and Moses is going, "God, what are you doing?" Like, and God says, "What are you crying out to me for?" It's like even God's against him now. Come on, stretch your hand out over the water. Like, don't you know the power that I've given you? Stretch your hand out over the water. And so he does. And all of a sudden the water starts to part, and God brings this huge wind and dries it all out. And it took faith for them to go, "Okay, water over there, I guess we can go through." So I think it's applicable for all of us in terms of trusting God for the next steps in our lives. And you know, here's another, the unknown. I don't know how many of you have been with people right when they're dying or just shortly before they're dying. And if Jesus doesn't come back first, we're all going to be there someday. Now, some of us will die very quickly, but others of us won't die really quickly. But at some point, you have to think, hold on, I'm going there right now. I remember being with one fella, and he was on life support and had been on life support for some time, but he was conscious. And so they were talking about pulling the plug. And we had to walk him through, because I knew once they do that, he's going to be with Jesus. And he's conscious at that point. And it makes all the difference if we have true faith in God, how we're going to do at that point. And it is the unknown, and I understand that. But it makes all the difference. Do we really know who he is? Because all of us are going to at some point step into the unknown, where it's like, okay, here we go. And I believe we can totally do that with confidence and trust. Okay, I've banked my life on this, and I'm going to bank my death on this. and in many ways, that's what they were doing. Okay, here we go. We're doing this thing. And then we know what God did. They got through. Finally, God, removed obstacle where they couldn't move ahead, and then they went all rushing into the sea, and God closed the whole thing up, and the enemy's drowned. And again, we go, whoa, that's brutal. It is. But it's a demonstration of what God wants to do in people's lives. And if we keep resisting, and we just end resisting, there is destruction. But if we embrace the life that he's given us, and not just as a fire insurance, but to go, hey, I want to live my life that way. I want to live my life in faith in Jesus. That's where real life comes from. So, I just want to call us again afresh to faith, because I believe it totally makes a difference how we live in every day. Do we live in, oh no, what's going to happen? Or do we go, well, okay, here's some unknown, but I'm going to trust God. Oh, I don't know what's going to happen in the future with this. Well, let's be wise. Let's ask God for wisdom. But it makes all the difference if we proceed with faith. And we're not just proceeding in faith. We're not just trying to be positive. There's a big difference between, okay, I'll just be positive. No, it's not just being positive. We're putting our faith in Jesus. We're trusting God. And so I just want to call us afresh to that whole thing. That's what this whole series is about in the middle of Hebrews. Let's be those kind of people.